So the next talk is Sellam Ismail, who founded the Vintage Computer Festival back in 1997. He kindly let the Vintage Computer Federation acquire it last year, and we invited him back here to be a judge and to tell us about the history of the event itself and what he's up to now. So, Sellam, you're done taping the presentation over there. We can start talking about it. I just want to say, none of this would be here without Sellam, and changed my life because I showed up for my first VCF in 2004 just to attend, and this is now my 15th VCF. Because it's his fault. It's his fault.
You asked for it. Alright. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you. Familiar faces. Welcome to the rebirth of the Vintage Computer Festival West. And thank you. Thanks to the team, the March team. You did a fantastic job. In case you aren't aware, and I'll get into this a little bit later. The last VCF was number 10 in 2007, and it took a hiatus and kind of dropped off the map after that. And a lot of people probably wondering what happened. So we tell the story, but in order to tell the story, we got to go back to the beginning. So I first became interested in computers around the age of 10, and back then, if you remember, this is the 80s, early 80s, and department stores used to start carrying, having a computer department. And most of the computers would be like Commodores and Ataris and Texas Instruments models. And I was fascinated by them. So when I go to the store with my parents, they would go off to do the shopping, and I would just run to the computer section and just start messing around with these machines. And I remember one time I saw somebody make the computer print a phrase over and over again. I was like, wow, how did they do that? And so I tried to figure it out. I went up there and typed the phrase I wanted to repeat, and then looked for the repeat endlessly button on the keyboard, but couldn't find it. It was only later that I realized that you could type 10, print whatever, and 20 go to 10, and run. But that was my first experience, and I really wanted to have a computer, but we grew up, not poor, but it wasn't something that we could afford until one day I saw a advertisement in the mail for a timeshare somewhere out in the woods. And if we went to the timeshare and took the tour, at the end of the tour, you would get a free gift. And a lot of times it was like a microwave oven or a toaster or something. Well, in this case, it was a computer. So I bugged my parents and got them to take me out to this timeshare. They went through the 2 hours of the hard sell and everything. And at the end, we got my computer, which was a Mattel Aquarius. And most people probably aren't familiar with the Aquarius, but it was, somebody was telling me that it was, the joke about it was that it was 1983 when it was released, but it was the computer for the 70s, which I thought was pretty funny because it was very dinky and didn't have a lot of memory, but I spent a year on that and taught myself how to program, so I was about 13 at this point. And then a year into that, a little over a year after that, I taught myself, like I said, programming and wrote all kinds of games and things. I wrote a comic book, a database program to store my comic book collection and things like that. I spent a lot of time with it, but I wanted a real computer. I wanted an Apple II like all my cousins had. So I sold my Aquarius and the Atari 2600 to fund my first Apple II Plus purchase. And quickly after that, I started to feel regret and longing for my old friend, the Aquarius. And so I vowed after that I would never part with my old computers. And so that's when I began the accumulation phase. There's two phases you enter as a collector. You first start accumulating, then you become a collector, where they actively go out and start looking for computers that you don't have. So I became an Apple IIe, a 2 Plus owner, then a 2E. And then one day, my brother, my oldest brother, was working construction, and he brought home from a construction site a bunch of sold dumb terminals and things like that that were abandoned at the site. And I thought they were immensely cool. And I was going to have a picture of the piece that I acquired from me. He said, "Oh, you can take whatever one you want." So I'm like, "Okay, cool. I'm going to take this." And it was this big, beefy. It was a Texas Instruments Silent 700 model 733. Some of you are familiar with that, but it's these models. The later models are suitcase portables that are dumb terminals. The earliest model, the Model 733, actually was a big bulky unit from the early 70s. It had a full keyboard and it had a big console display with all these great lights and switches, and that was the main attraction for it. And it had 2 digital cassette tapes. And it was basically a replacement, digital replacement for like a teletype ASR 33, because it had the storage, the local storage, and all that. But anyway, it was something that was just very cool. I had to have it. I got it, and that was the first time I acquired something that I had absolutely no purpose for. And so that was really the beginning of the collection. In the meantime, I started getting computers from friends who, they had a computer, their parents bought them for Christmas or whatever, and they were hoping that they would become computer programmers or engineers or something. And they just quickly got bored, so I ended up with basic stuff like a Commodore 64, TI-99, some Ataris, and my interest wasn't so much just to have them, but I wanted to explore all these various computers and find out how they all worked, because back then, of course, there was no real standards, and they were all different, and I just wanted to, I was interested in all of them. So I slowly began acquiring a collection, and by the late 80s, I had a closet full of computers, old computers, obsolete computers, and my mother would often ask me what I was doing with them, and I said, well, I'll probably start a museum someday or something, which was just an excuse to get her off my back. And then in the mid-90s, I grew up, became a software programmer, engineer, and was making good money. And then one day, I was at a place called Denio's Auction in Roseville, just walking around, and I came across a stall where a guy had 25 vintage machines from early 80s, basically all 80s machines, 8-bit micros, things like that. So I just started to get flushed and excited. I'm like, I gotta have these, I must have them. So I went around the corner and composed myself, because I was too excited to negotiate. I didn't want to take my hand, so I went back around the corner, talked to this guy, I said, hey, I'm interested in some of your computers. And he goes, which ones? And I said, all of them. His eyes really big. So anyway, I negotiated $5 a piece, basically. For $100, I filled up my trunk in the backseat of my car with all these machines. And so I was in heaven, and I brought them all home and lovingly cleaned them all up and tested all the ones and tested them all out. Noted down the problems with the ones that didn't work, and then carefully and lovingly packed them all away in anti-static bags and bone peanuts and put them in boxes and stored away in my garage. Without any idea what I would do with them one day, other than, yeah, maybe, these will be important someday, these are going to be museum pieces someday. I felt that inherently, that they were going to be eventually obsolete and unobtainable, and so I took it upon myself to start preserving this. It was just out of personal interest. Then in early 1997, a guy named Bill Whitson started a mailing list on the internet, an invitation on the classic computers mailing list. And I thought, wow. And in the introduction was this list is for people who collect old computers. If you want to be part of it, email me and tell me why you should be on the list. And yeah, so that was the first time I realized that there was other people who were weird like me, accumulating old computers for no reason. So I got on the list, and it quickly grew, and it was really exciting because now you can talk to people who share your interest in a hobby that I didn't know was a hobby before, but also I started finding things a lot of money. And so that generated a lot of excitement with me. I was making a lot of money at the time, and I lived in Silicon Valley, and it was at a time, this is 1997, when these machines were too old to be useful, but too new to be collectible. So I proceeded to used every resource I could. I discovered all the surplus shops around Silicon Valley, flea markets, sometimes garage sales, lots of thrift stores, and just began lining up all this stuff every time I saw, not everything, but a lot of it, because it was for me, it was a process of discovering. First of all, that computers, were made in the 1940s. That was something that I didn't. And then I started discovering computers before the 8-bit era, like the S100 machines and that. So it was really fun, and I proceeded to amass this huge collection that outgrew my garage, outgrew storage, outgrew the first warehouse I had in Oakland, outgrew the second warehouse I had in Livermore, et cetera, et cetera. And the collection literally snowballed, and it would just become bigger and bigger every single time I moved it, like you double in size. And moving it was, I started to call it my ball and chain eventually, because I had to take it everywhere and protect it. It was an important thing for me, of course. As the middle of this grew, it became apparent to me by about the spring of '97, so it was just a few months old, and it grew quite a bit. Lots of people, lots of activity, lots of posting. And so I thought, well, we're a group now, we should have a convention for computers. So I proposed the Classic Computer Convention. And there's a lot of interest, a lot of favorable feedback on it. So I said, okay, well, I'm going to do the Vintage Computer Festival, the Vintage Computer Festival, instead of the Classic Computer Convention. And the first event was held at the Alameda County Fairgrounds in Pleasanton on October 26th and 27th, 1987. And the first speaker was Bill Fernandez, and most people are aware that Bill Fernandez introduced Steve Jobs to Steve Wozniak. And so I got connected up to a lot of interesting people for that first speaker again. Oh, and the whole idea about the Vintage Computer Festival, as I conceived it, was to really be an event about the history of computers, obviously, but learning more about them, not just the machines themselves, but the people who made them. So for me, the important aspect of it has always been the speaker series, getting the stories of people who weren't necessarily in the spotlight, like we've had in Steve Wozniak over the years. Lots of luminaries came through here, but for me, the favorite for me were the people that never heard of them, because I liked getting stories wouldn't have been told if not for some chance encounter and collecting with some guy who worked in such and such company, or he was the engineer for this, or the designer for that, or whatever. So I through my collecting, was able to find a lot of interesting people that would bring into the VCF to tell their story. So that first year, I got a lot of helpful referrals from people. So I got Bill Fernandez, and then the last speaker of that VCF one was Lee Felsenstein and Bob Marsh. And so it's kind of appropriate that Lee is going to close out the event today for the final speaker as well. So that first event had about 150 attendees. I thought it was a failure because I lost a huge amount of money on it, but everybody else was really pleased with the turnout and encouraged me, and so I continued to produce events. And so next year I did the VCF again, except this time it was at the Santa Clara Convention Center, a much nicer facility, and that's where I met Hans. Hans Franca, so you know all about Hans, but you know Hans, and he was basically my counterpart in Germany. He was a prolific collector in Germany, and found out about the festival, came, was torn up that he missed the first one, but he wanted to bring the festival back to Germany, and so that's where VCF Europa started. Hans began to produce, it still produces the VCF Europa music. And then in 2000, year 2000, I had gone through some life changes with the company I was working for and went into business for myself. And by that time, my collection was fairly large. There were several hundred computers. It filled up a warehouse in Oakland. It was maybe, I don't know, 2,000 or 3,000 square feet. And one day I got approached by an engineer who was hired by a law firm to find a computer that would invalidate a patent. What it was, if you remember, maybe some of you might remember, there was a company called E-Machines. And E-Machines was sued by Compaq over the design of the door, over a port panel in front of the computer that hid the serial ports. And so he was hired by the law firm to find what's called prior art. Prior art is any device, writing, or something that basically described the idea that it was patentable before it was actually patentable. And so he gave me the ability to ask if he could roll through my collection and maybe find something. It's the first time I ever even considered that I could make money from the collection doing it. Before, I had already thought, well, I need to offset some of the costs of storing stuff. And so my idea was to rent out my computers as props to Hollywood. But this is the first time that I became aware that there was a lucrative business consulting. So he ended up renting 3 computers from me, and not sure what the disposition of the case was, but from that, I started Vintage Tech. It was my consulting firm starting in 2000. And I thought about all the core services that I could provide. The first being patent litigation consulting and support. Props to Hollywood and TV production. I had been doing appraisals by that point for the computer histories, and most of them were first for computer histories. So I added appraisals to my list of services. Eventually I began building replicas of computers that just weren't around anymore, like the KP1. I built 4 replicas of the KP1, anywhere from full scale to partial, for various museums around the world. The first one went into the National Science Museum in Tokyo. So I was doing that and did a lot of consulting for universities recovering data, and a lot of data recovery, a lot of interesting projects. In fact, at ASR and Silent 700 that I talked about the first day in my collection, I used that later on to read some digital cassette tapes. The data office of digital cassette tapes, 2 different clients brought me. The first one was, I think it was the gentleman himself. He was a student at a seminary in Arizona. He wrote letters to his mother. These long, very beautifully written letters. He wanted to get them off, or his mother, I forget who it was that wanted me to recover them, but I did recover them using the Silent 700, which was cool because I finally got to learn how to use it in one actually. At any rate, so that was going well. The business started to grow, and I was on my own doing it. And then in 2003, I started E-Cycle, which is electronic waste recycling facility. And that sort of came about by accident, but it was a perfect matchup for what I was doing. From 2000 till about 2003, my collection was stored at the Alameda County Computer. I'm going to be going on a lot longer than 10 minutes. We don't have anything after this, so I'm going to be going on. We were going to talk about it. All right. Anyway, so the Alameda County Computer Resource Center at the time was probably the largest nonprofit computer recycling operation probably on the planet. They recycled and refurbished and placed hundreds, if not thousands, of computers all over the world, every continent, including Antarctica. This was founder James Burgett's a very mercurial figure, to say the least. Had delusions of grandeur and God complex and all that, but I still love and respect him. Despite that, but he gave me the space I needed to store my collection, and also gave me access to the stuff, so my collection grew hugely. And then we had a falling out, temporary falling out, and I had to find my own place. And that's how I came up with the idea to start the electronics recycling business. The idea was to be a reception center or a receiving center in Liverpool for people who had e-waste, and then I would transfer that to Berkeley. It worked out really well, and eventually I broke off and became independent. Just last year I finally closed the business down because that business is based on commodities, metals, and the metals market has just been trashed since the last few years, so I finally shut that down. In the meantime, the VCFs continue to produce the VCF West every year. And there started to become demand for VCFs in other parts of the country that were closer to people who couldn't travel. So in 2001, I launched VCF East in Marlborough, Massachusetts, suburb of Boston. And then at VCF 6, which was in 2003, that's where I met Evan. Evan was really excited about everything. He wanted to become involved, and so I organized the VCF East 2.0 in about 2004. And wait, the time right here is going to mess up. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Basically, Evan came on board after VCF 2, and so after VCF East 2.0, I handed everything off to Evan, and then Evan took it from there and started large and obvious and all that. He deserves a lot of credit for that, because they did a really good job of taking that event over and developing it out. We also then had, of course, we had the VCF Europa now and VCF East. We had the Yankees. At some point, we had a UK event started up that was kind of loosely affiliated. The way the VCF always worked is if you wanted to run a VCF or hold a VCF, you just contact me and I would say, okay, and I give them my cheat sheet, my top secret document how to run a VCF. Send that to them. I said, read this, and if it makes sense, if you have any questions, let me know. If you still want us to do one, then let's start planning. So it's basically just an ad hoc process. It was just based on whoever was interested in doing one out of passion. Because the events really didn't make money. In the beginning, they were money losers. Eventually, they did make money. It's not like big money making. It's really for the fun, passion, hobby. So we had a VCF UK, we had a VCF Italia one year, VCF Midwest launched in 2005 with Pat Finnegan, and now the VCF Midwest is being run by Jack Rubin, a few people out there in the Chicago area. VCF Southwest launched by Gil Carrick in 2010, and then we had VCF, which is dormant right now. We have VCF Southeast, which started in 2015, and that's active in mind. So we have VCF events all around the world. Now in 2005, I worked here at the museum as the first software curator. I did that for a little over a year until my business just became too busy. And so I quit that position and went back to my consulting full time. And the last VCF that we held here that I produced was VCF 10 in 2007. By that time, I'd started a family and business was doing well. And we run the VCF for 10 years. And it was just kind of I was getting worn out and didn't relish having another VCF event the next year, especially with how busy I was and the economy started to tank. I just didn't feel like I wanted to do it. But after that event on Sunday night, it was me, Jack Rubin, Evan, Hans, and Marvin. Marvin's last name. I haven't seen Marvin in a while, actually. And another young fellow from Texas, who I can't remember his name, but they convinced me. They said, "No, you can't take a hiatus. You'll lose momentum." And I said, "Okay, well, if everybody here helps me out, then we'll do it." So that was a great. But then in 2008, the economy crashed, and I was anticipating it. I've been doing research, and I kind of knew what was happening, and so I started preparing myself all the way here. And as we got closer to the crash, that's traditionally when the VCF is going to fall. And the economy was just not doing well. I was just too tied down with my work and family and everything to hold the event. So I just kind of quietly skipped it. There was no complaints. I think everybody was preoccupied. So I skipped it, and then was thinking, okay, eventually I'll start it back up again. But on Valentine's Day in 2009, I broke my ankle. I fell through my ceiling in my house while I was trying to wire up a new connection for cable TV. And fell through the ceiling, came down square on my right ankle, which took the brunt of the fall. And I basically crushed my, it was basically a crushing injury, but I was unable to walk now for a good 3 months. And so in that time, the economy was already pretty crappy, and now I couldn't work, I couldn't walk. And so things started to get a little sketchy financially and otherwise. And so by that time, I had started to have an awakening. The crash in 2008, subsequent bailout of the bankers, got me really upset. It got me thinking that something was seriously wrong. And so around that time, my interests were in chemistry and metal engineering, interested in precious metals and recovering them from electronic scrap, which was what quantum stuff, and gold and silver hot commodity around the time. And so I was a lot of my, I was doing a lot of studying in metallurgy and chemistry, and having a lab, practicing automobiles and things like that. But after I broke my ankle and became disillusioned with what was happening, I started to just read. Because all I could do was just sit on my butt out all day, sometimes literally up to 20 hours a day. Minimum, probably 8 to 12, sometimes all day, all night, just reading. And I studied all kinds of stuff, but primarily law, because I wanted to figure out what was going on in this country. So I put all my studies into law, history, North and recent, ancient, politics, religion, esoteric, occult, secret societies, ancient myths and legends, astronomy, astrology, numbers and math, and sacred geometry, just went deep down the rabbit hole. I went a little bit insane. Trying to digest all this information because one thing really led to another. And I felt that in a way I was being initiated as this information, just really obscure information started to fall before me. The answers that I sought started to get, or the questions that I had started to get answered. And of course, as more questions started to pop up. I had put all interest in computers aside at this point, and most of my study was in law. I started to teach myself law because I was going up against basically everything that everyone in society had to do with government and banks. Just done with them, and I was learning law to protect myself and free myself from what I felt was a slave existence. But that's a whole other story that I'm not going to get into. The thing, though, is that in early 2012, the collection by that time had moved into a 10,000 square foot warehouse in Sellam. And it took up literally the whole warehouse. And I had planned to make that the final archive location for the Managed Computer Festival archives in the Managed I envisioned it being a place where anywhere from customers to scholars to hobbyists could come and have full access to the collection and be organized on shelves and indexed and cataloged and everything that was defined. And the idea was if you wanted to create any kind of computing environment, early days all the way through to modern times, everything gave its place. You know how to find it, where to find it, you go assemble it, find yourself a workstation, put it all together. You envisioned people doing research projects can come and just sit there and work on a computer that they're trying to learn about, or for data recovery operations, I would have everything already in place, easily able to find what I needed to cover on tape, disk, whatever. But things were complicated because of my ankle injury and how that affected my business and my money. So early 2012, I started to fall behind on rent in stock markets. And it wasn't an unusual occurrence. This happened cyclically because that's the nature of the business. Usually, when the legal consulting was by far the primary work that I did through my consulting. And then I had a recycling business. And so a lot of times when the consulting was doing well, the recycling would be like in a different phase. It would be down, the consulting started to die off. The recycling operation would start to pick up. And so it's kind of a nice balancing thing, but sometimes we get out of sync and go a couple months without getting enough income to pay the bills. Landlords were always very nice about it and would let me slide, and I eventually was come back with the money and it was fine, and I intended to be a long-term tenant. And seemed to have a great relationship. Well, around springtime, they started to get really irritated with me. I don't really know why. Like I said, I was having a good relationship. Now they started to be real demanding, wanted me to pay for. So I was scrambling to come up with the money to get up to date on rent. In the meantime, I didn't like the way they were treating me, so I started to look for another warehouse with whom we had begun. We had been talking about renewing lease, but I ended up just deciding to get a small warehouse. I think they wanted to raise the revenue. I can't remember the details there, but eventually they lost patience and they filed an unlawful detainer, which is the first step in recovering the property from the renter. And they got the judgment by default. I missed the hearing by a minute because I was confused as to which court I was supposed to. That was neither here nor there. I wasn't interested in funding them. I just wanted to pay them so that I could work out amicably either staying there or moving the collection to a new place, which by then I think I either already had or was in negotiations. Well, at this point, the landlords, I believe, began to engage in some shenanigans. And it didn't occur to me at the time, and this is still just an accusation, but it's my belief that they did this on purpose. They might have been noticed on Monday to rent to people, and then when they fell behind their rent, they would just pick them, and they would keep their stuff, or the people just never came back to get their stuff. I don't know everything. I don't know why these people thought that I would just simply abandon 10,500 square foot warehouse left to the guilds with history of that. It's unprecedented as far as I'm concerned. I always put the claim out there that it was the largest privately held collection of vintage computers in the planet. Challenge me for many years ago that I put that claim out there. So they failed to send me proper notice as to when the sheriff came and locked me out. So I didn't find out until a good 10 days or so into the 15-day process, or the 15-day period of time when you're legally allowed to go recover the property. Even if I did have the full 15 days, there was really no time to get everything out of that point. A lot of it was still on pallets when we moved in from Livermore in 2009. Everything pretty much remained on pallets, and so it wasn't going to be that big of a job to move in. But I was still going to have to palletize a bunch of stuff that had come into collection after. So for the next 2 months, the landlord started to squeeze me. The landlord actually quoted me when I finally called him and said, hey, I noticed we're locked out. I thought we were trying to work this out. He was kind of rude to me. He told me, quote, I'm holding it for ransom, which is a good quote. And then he also said, quote, I'm going to milk it for every dime that I can get. So his theory was that he was going to hold it for ransom, until which time I paid him this back rent that they believed I owed them. Well, in the meantime, I did try to pay them. After the judgment, the unlawful detainer judgment, they said that they were owed $3,381.60. So I went to their office one day when I had brought a witness with me. I tendered the $3,381.60 in cash. Gave it to their secretary, who I was getting rent to. She counted it out. She was about to write me a receipt, and she said, oh wait, let me call her boss to make sure I should take it. So, okay, this is kind of what I was anticipating, because these people just were acting irrationally and stupid. And so me having studied law, knowing finer points of law, I knew that there's a possibility they might reject the tender for some dumb reason. And if they did, I would have a witness to show that I did make the tender, because under the law, when you make a tender of a debt owed and it's refused, then that debt has been discharged. So if you owe somebody $500, let's say, and you go to them and you say, well, I have 500 ones. I don't want, come on, give me hundreds. Come back and you have hundreds. I don't want these single ones. Well, that's basically discharge of the debt, because I gave you good tender. This is 500 $1 notes, legal tender, but you refused it, so under the law, that's discharge. So this debt that they said I owed them didn't exist. Even if it did, they would still have to sue to get that judgment indemnity, which they did not do. There was no judgment for any past due rent with the unlawful detainer. It was just you no longer have possession of the building, and now you need to get your stuff out. and I was being denied access to the collection. And so from that point, for about the next 2 months, so I was being squeezed. I had no way to make money because the collection was trapped behind a locked door. So I started, my finances started to suffer, and I started getting further and further behind. And I started to send a series of letters to the landlords explaining to them the law and every point of it that was important to them in terms of what they were supposed to do. And those letters went unanswered. And I put them in a proper legal format as notices of demand, gave them timelines to respond. I was doing everything properly, but they were just simply ignoring me. And so one day, after I had sent the letters informing them of the proper procedure for property left over by a tenant after they've been evicted, they finally got wise and sent me a notice saying they're going to put it up for public auction, which is what we're supposed to do after it hasn't been, property hasn't been claimed. And the notice was what I call illegible because it didn't include certain information or anything. So I warned them not to go ahead with it. They indicated that they were going to, so I filed suit to stop it and filed for a temporary restraining order. Well, when I went in court for the temporary restraining order, I didn't expect to be, my hand to be held by the judge, but in this case, he was actually in the hospital. And it was basically, I got nowhere in the area, so I had no protection in this point. So, and I, was still, I wasn't an expert attorney or anything, so I didn't know what to do. So I was basically between a rock and a hard place, and I felt like the only thing I could do was just go and negotiate this people. I could work something out with them. And so outside the courtroom, I approached them and told them that they already had an agreement for me actually to sign for a storage agreement to give me time to remove the stuff. So that was a step in the positive step in the right direction. So I figured I could do it in about 2 weeks. There's no reason why I shouldn't have. I've done this plenty of times before. Like I said, everything was pretty much already packed and ready to go. So pretty much packed. And then getting trucks and getting across town to the warehouse. So, well, everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. Because of the lockout, my old clunky World War II era forklift stopped working. I had to spend a day and a half fixing that. Rain had entered in from both ends of the warehouse. It was flooding out huge portions of it, damaging all kinds of property that was on the ground, books and manuals for the board particularly. So I had to spend a couple days mitigating that, lifting the stuff off of the ground, getting it on the pallets, there's literally like an inch of water on some places going on. This is something the landlords under the law are responsible for. They must keep the property. It's their responsibility to protect the property. I see it, I'm going to be done a little. So the move wasn't going well. Out of about 200 pallets that I had, I managed to move about 40 pallets over to the new warehouse until I just kind of ran out of steam, ran out of energy, money, people to help, etc. It just was a brick wall. So I pleaded with the landlord to give me an extension or to let me basically move. Give me about a week, I'd come back and pay all the storage costs that I had incurred since then. And just continue to move. I told them I'm just going to need 3 more days. And so they reluctantly agreed to that. Because again, they were still being kind of unreasonable. And so about a week later, a little over a week, I contacted them and said, okay, I'm ready to resume. But then I was hit from this attorney with a new list of demands. They wanted me to get a liability insurance policy. They wanted me to rent the facility, pay them storage costs through the end of the month, at the end of December. A couple other things that were just unreasonable. And so I'm like, okay. So I decided to play hardball. I countered with a counter offer saying, okay, well, I'll agree to that as long as you pay me $1,000 for the damage to my property that you're responsible for preventing, etc. The response I got back from the attorney was, I'm sorry you rejected our offer. It's technically under contract law when you do a counter offer. Technically, it's a rejection of the original offer. So she played it that way, and a few days later, I asked a friend of mine if he could go by the warehouse because I could live in the warehouse in Stockton, it's 40 minutes away. I asked a friend who worked in Stockton if he lived in Stockton, go by and see what's going on. calls me back about half an hour later, so you better get out here, move your stuff out. So they had hired a recycling company, actually a computer company, and started taking my stuff out. So he had followed one of the trucks, found out where they were going. I went to that address. I think called the police ahead of time to let them know what's happening. It's called a civil stand. Police officer would just go and witness them. They completed with them. So not do with her. So I had to sue again, filed another lawsuit that day, and filed for another temporary restraining order. And this time I met some success in the court. The judge this time saw some merit in my claims, put a temporary restraining order for a week from the recycling company from doing anything supposed to collection for until the next hearing, which was scheduled for Friday, December 21st, 2012. And we walked. So the deal was, they asked at that first hearing, I think it was on Tuesday, but this time everything had been moved into private recycling departments. So now they were moving to both landlords and private recycling. And the judge asked, she turned to them, the landlord said, "How much does this man make?" He said, $6,000 and some dollars, which was BS. And he turned to me and he said, "Can you come up with $6,000 by this Friday?" I said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Okay, everybody come back on Friday, we'll go from there." So I thought, great, this is the collection. My father loaned me the money I needed, showed up on Friday, tried to tender the money to their attorney before the court started in, she said, and then during the court, the judge asked, "Did you put in the money?" I said, "Yes, sir." I put it on the table, pushed it over to their side, and then their attorney got up and said a bunch of words, and it was very dramatic. And said, "So we reject Mr. Ismail's tender," and pushed the money back across the table. And basically, at this point, they were guilty of, for certain, conversion. To quickly explain what conversion is basically civil theft. Criminal theft would be that's a crime if you steal from the cops get involved. Civil theft is a tort. And civil theft is called conversion, and conversion is what's called a strict liability tort, which means once you committed it, that's it, you're done. You've done it. There's no going back. There's no apologizing. You owe the person whose property you converted the value of the property, plus trouble damages 3 times the value of the property. So basically they knew, as far as I'm concerned, they knew that they were screwed. They knew that they had committed this violation, and they were trying to cover it up with their attorney's help. In fact, in the lawsuit, I named the attorney as an unindicted co-conspirator. I don't say unindicted co-conspirator. She was involved, and I reserve my right to add her to the scene because I truly believe that it's her duty to tell them how to obey the law, not how to skirt it. And that's what they were doing. And then Tri-Valley Recycling lied and said it cost them $63,000 to move the collection of 1 mile across Canada, which is complete horseshit. At the time, I couldn't figure out what's going on. The judge basically said, "Look, I don't know how you're going to recover from this, but you owe them $63,000 now. So I'm going to rule against you," and that was that. And the hardest part about all this is while I was fighting them in court in Stockton, in San Joaquin County, I was also fighting the illegal foreclosure and sale of my house in Allegheny County. So every week I was being torn back and forth between these 2 battles, and it became increasingly difficult to try to keep up, and I just couldn't. So on December 20th in Hayward, I got the ruling came down from the judge who went on the container case on the house, and I lost the house. And the next day, the ruling came down. Collection. So I had to sit there and watch 25 years of my life, work I put into it, sold off these movies. So that's what happened. That's what happened in the collection. After that, basically the passion died. All the work that I put into it, there's no way to I thought it would be possible, maybe possible to try to get the collection done. It was done. I had just resigned myself to the fact that the collection was destroyed. The plans I had for it. So slowly over time, I eventually accepted it and have been selling off pieces of the collection ever since then to invest myself in it entirely. So at this point, still have a sizable amount of stuff. There's 40 pallets worth of warehouse assortments. Plus the core collection of the most important pieces that never left my possession in my garage or in other warehouses with more. So I did keep a substantial part of the collection, but again, the fact is I would never be able to do what I wanted to do with it. My passion was gone. So keeping a core part of it, there's certain parts of the collection, small parts that I'm going to keep. But most of it is eventually going to be sold off. If anyone's interested, contact me afterwards. Warehouse is stocked and shopping, but it's a big project. I really don't even know how to start because it's just going to be a lot of work. But anyway, the reason, the whole purpose of this talk was to sort of clear the air and give the story from my perspective. There's been a lot of speculation and lack of information out there because I basically just fall out of existence. Didn't really get a chance to ever properly tell stories. So, appreciate the opportunity. So, thanks for coming. So, any questions? Thank you very much. Yeah, great questions for You got a microphone, Evan? Or right now, I'm really not doing anything of note. I'm just kind of biding my time and taking it easy. And just catching up on many years of I don't know. I just abide. But it's not like it's a temporary thing. I'm literally just kind of taking it slow, taking it easy, and I'm trying to force myself into anything. I have a lot of irons in the fire. I'm going to be at some point probably starting up an auction house for high-end vintage computers. In the meantime, I'm doing consulting work for an auction house on the East Coast that primarily does space memorabilia, and they're branching out into vintage computers, and so they're hiring me on as a consultant. So I'm doing stuff like that still. Occasionally, I do some legal consulting, and I'm still doing appraisals. But for the most part, I'm just taking it easy. Yes. Okay, so the computer flooring. At the Alameda County Computer Resource Center, it was in an old warehouse that was a milk factory, an ice cream factory prior. So the space that James gave us to set up a computer museum there, the floor was very uneven. It was graded to allow water runoff from the drains and stuff. And so we needed to flatten out the space. And at the time, Lawrence Livermore Labs in Livermore was at auctions where they would give off or sell off certain stuff. And I went there one day and they had pallets of computer floor tiles from their old computers. And I thought, oh, this is great. We can buy this and we can make a flat computer, traditional computer floor and everything. So I acquired, actually they gave it to us because through the nonprofit, through the Alameda County Computer Resource Center. So I hauled like literally tons of this stuff. It was like, I don't know how many tons, it was literally tons. Stacked it on the side of my house, then moved it to Oakland, hauled all of it piece by piece upstairs because there was a lift, but it just wasn't practical. So up the stairs, all these tiles were in, stacked tons of these tiles upstairs. For whatever reason, they never finished that project. So then they got thrown basically back over the railing, which James didn't want, but I did when he wasn't around, and I had part of my boxes down there. But basically just ended up scrapping all these out. But there was a positive outcome from this. My wife at the time, it was her birthday was coming up, and we wanted to have a big party. In fact, that was when I was going to propose to her. And so I used the computer floor tiles to build a nice big patio in my backyard that actually lasted for several years. So I didn't have, the one thing I didn't get with them was the support. So I had to make this lattice of 1x2 wood slats that would fit everything in. And it lasted pretty well through rainstorms and everything. A good 3 years before it started falling apart. And the second question. Oh no, that was on Kirby. And no, the answer is no. I had this computer. This is one of the computers that was lost in the conversion. Kirby was a PCC 2000. Basically like a big beefy computer built in a desk. Or no, it's just a big beefy computer. The woman who gave it to me, her father was a former detective, and he wrote a detective novel. And they wanted me to get it. Her father was in poor health and I think died not too long thereafter. But she wanted me to get it off of the computer so that they could, either publish it or whatever. I just had it for posterity. No, unfortunately, I never got around to that project because it was really just when you get around to it kind of thing. The woman was very nice and didn't really have put big pressure on me or anything. Unfortunately. Any other questions? Because I have duties to attend. The which ones? The tapes? Oh, yeah. Oh, so as a side note, I've been accumulating all of the recordings from the VCF since the beginning, and they're across all kinds of media on cassette tape and CDs later on, but also even VHS tapes when we recorded the audio on the VHS tape. And I've been talking with Kevin Savitz, for the longest time now about getting these into his hands, but I was just very protective of them, and I wanted to make sure, first of all, I accumulated everything, because I didn't want to send one shipment. And I was always reticent about giving it over to FedEx or whatever, because that's 10 years basically history of VCF, all the most important things to me, which is the talks. And so finally last night, met up with Kevin, came in and put it in his custody, and he's on, well, he's probably off the plane by now. That's going to be all digitized and put online on the website and added to all the other archives that are up there. So you'll be able, hopefully within the next couple months or whatever, as soon as Kevin's done, be able to go back and access all the talks from the VCF the first 10 years. Most of them, we didn't, there's some holes unfortunately, but all the way back to VCF 1 on forward. So I'm very excited. Thank you very much, folks. I really appreciate you coming out. Thanks to Adam for doing a wonderful job for this event. It's every bit as good as any event that I've ever held, and I'm really proud of my protege. And I'm glad that I made the decision to hand it off to him because I think I gave it to the right guy to not only continue the event, but to really develop it into the future. This is really an evolution, and with the VCF, the Vintage Computer Federation, as it's now called, combining other efforts from different people, and this is going to be really fun and exciting going forward. I look forward to coming back year after year and just being an attendee. So, Dave, thanks for coming in. Enjoy the rest of the show.